with her family, which includes a spouse, 4 kids, a tuxedo cat, and a bearded dragon. So welcome back, Leah. We also want to make sure you know about our upcoming UU the Vote campaign and launch event. The event will be here at the church after the service on July 31st and will be followed by many opportunities for volunteering between now and the fall midterm elections, when our church community will be writing letters to encourage voter participation in key districts throughout the country. If you too are outraged by the way our political systems are eroding human rights and democratic systems right now, please join us. You can read more on our website or in our e-news to stay updated. And lastly, I want to invite everyone to join us after the service for social hour. We will be resuming our usual social hour in Fuller Hall downstairs after the service. And also for those of you joining us online, we have our Zoom social hour, and there will be a QR code after the service that will take you there. Once again, welcome everybody. So now let us take a moment to greet our neighbors, both here in the sanctuary and by chat if we're online. Reverend Leah will now light the flame of our chalice on the chancel this morning. If you are joining us from home and have a chalice that you would like to light, I invite you to do that now. We are Unitarian Universalists. We light this chalice in faith, in hope, and in love.
Oh, thank you, choir. It's good to be back here. Once the world was perfect, says U.S. Poet Laureate Joe Harjo, and we were happy in that world. Then we took it for granted. Discontent began a small rumble in the earthly mind. We had no place to live, since we didn't know how to live with each other. Then one of the stumbling ones took pity on another and shared a blanket. Everyone worked together to make a ladder and finally climbed out into the next world, to now, into this morning light, to you. With these words, and this time together, let us be gathered for worship. Will you join me in singing, Building Bridges? Our responsive reading is Conflict Resolution for Holy Beings. Set conflict resolution guidelines. Reduce defensiveness and break the defensiveness chain. I could hear the light beings as they entered every cell. Every cell is a house of the God of light, they said. I could hear the spirits who love us stomp dancing. They were dancing as if they were here, and then another level of here, and then another, until the whole earth and sky were dancing. We are here dancing, they said. There was no there. There was no I or you. There we were. There was we. There we were, as if we were the music. You cannot legislate music to lockstep, nor can you legislate the spirit of the music to stop at political boundaries, or poetry, or art, or anything that is of value or matters in this world and the next worlds. This is about getting to know each other. We will wind up back at the Blues, standing on the edge of the flatted Fifth, about to jump into a fierce understanding together. We get to sing again, Spirit of Life.
For our time for all ages this morning, I will be reading a story called Enemy Pie, which was written by Derek Munson and illustrated by Tara King. It should have been the perfect summer. My dad helped me build a treehouse in our backyard. My sister was at camp for 3 whole weeks, and I was on the best baseball team in town. It should have been a perfect summer, but it wasn't. It was all good until Jeremy Ross moved into the neighborhood, right next door to my best friend Stanley. I did not like Jeremy Ross. He laughed at me when he struck me out in a baseball game. He had a party on his trampoline and I wasn't even invited, but my best friend Stanley was. Jeremy Ross was the one and only person on my enemy list. I never even had an enemy list until he moved into the neighborhood. But as soon as he came along, I needed one. I hung it up in my treehouse where Jeremy Ross was not allowed to go. Dad understood stuff like enemies. He told me that when he was my age, he had enemies too. But he knew of a way to get rid of them. I asked him to tell me how. Tell you how? I'll show you how, he said. He pulled a really old recipe book off the kitchen shelf. Inside, there was a worn-out scrap of paper with faded writing. Dad held it up and squinted at it. Enemy pie, he said, satisfied. He talked quietly. There is one part of enemy pie that I can't make. In order for it to work, you need to spend a day with your enemy. Even worse, you have to be nice to him. It's not easy, but that's the only way that enemy pie can work. Are you sure you want to go through with this? Of course I was. It sounded horrible. It was scary, but it was worth a try. All I had to do was spend one day with Jeremy Ross, and then he'd be out of my hair for the rest of my life. So I rode my bike to his house and knocked on his door. When Jeremy opened the door, he seemed surprised. He stood on the other side of the screen door and looked at me. waiting for me to say something. I was nervous. "Can you play?" I asked. He looked confused. "I'll go ask my mom," he said. He came back with shoes in his hand. His mom walked around the corner to say hello. "You boys stay out of trouble," she said. So we rode bikes for a while and played on the trampoline. Then we made some water balloons and threw them at the neighbors, but we missed. Jeremy's mom made us lunch. After lunch, we went to my house. It was strange, but I was kind of having fun with my enemy. He almost seemed nice. But of course I couldn't tell Dad that. He had worked so hard all day to make this enemy pie. Jeremy Ross liked my basketball hoop. He said he wished he had a basketball hoop, but they didn't have room for one. I let him win a game, just to be nice. Jeremy knew how to throw a boomerang. He threw it, and it came right back to him. I threw it, and it went over my house and into the backyard. When we climbed the fence to find it, the first thing Jeremy noticed was my treehouse. My treehouse was my treehouse. I was the boss. If my sister wanted in, I didn't have to let her. If my dad wanted in, I didn't have to let him. And if Jeremy wanted in, "Can we go in it?" he asked. I knew he was going to ask me that, but he was the top person, the only person on my enemy list, and enemies aren't allowed in my treehouse. But he did teach me to throw a boomerang, and he did have me over for lunch, and he did let me play on his trampoline. He wasn't being a very good enemy. "Okay," I said, "but hold on." I climbed up ahead of him and tore the enemy list off the wall. I had a checkerboard and some cards in the treehouse, and we played games until my dad called us down for dinner. We pretended we didn't hear him, and when he came out to get us, we tried to hide from him. But he found us. Dad made macaroni and cheese for dinner, my favorite. It was Jeremy's favorite, too. Maybe Jeremy Ross wasn't so bad after all. I was beginning to think that maybe we should just forget about enemy pie. But sure enough, after dinner, Dad brought out the pie. I watched as he cut it into 8 thick slices. "Dad," I said, "it sure is nice having a new friend in the neighborhood." I was trying to get his attention, trying to tell him that Jeremy Ross was no longer my enemy, but Dad only smiled and nodded. I think he thought I was just pretending. Dad dished up 3 plates side by side with big pieces of pie and giant scoops of ice cream. He passed one to me and one to Jeremy. "Wow," Jeremy said, looking at the pie. "My dad never makes pies like this." It was at this point that I panicked. I didn't want Jeremy to eat enemy pie. He was my friend. I couldn't let him. "Jeremy, don't eat it. It's bad pie. I think it's poisonous or something." Jeremy's fork stopped before reaching his mouth. He crumpled up his eyebrows and looked at me funny. I felt relieved. I had saved his life. I was a hero. "If it's so bad," Jeremy asked, "then why has your dad already eaten half of it?" I turned to look at my dad. Sure enough, he was eating enemy pie. "Good stuff," he mumbled through the mouthful, and that was all he said. I sat there watching him eat enemy pie for a few seconds. Dad was laughing. Jeremy was happily eating, and neither of them was losing any hair. It seemed safe enough, so I took a tiny taste. Enemy pie was delicious. After dessert, Jeremy rode his bike home, but not before inviting me over to play on his trampoline the next day. He said he'd teach me how to flip. As for enemy pie, I still don't know how to make it. I still wonder if enemies really do hate it, or if their hair falls out, or their breath turns bad. But I don't know if I will ever get an answer, because I just lost my best enemy. And so now we turn to the portion of our service each week where we share our offering with an organization whose mission is aligned with our own. This July, we share our plate with Lift Every Voice Oregon, the statewide interfaith coalition that seeks to reduce gun violence across our state. Levo volunteers, including those in our congregation, have been working this spring to get gun control legislation on the ballot in the November general election. We are grateful to Levo for their long-term public advocacy and organizing to make our communities safer. If you are joining this morning via live stream and wish to give your offering, you may click the donate button on Boxcast or use the QR code that will appear on the screen. Those of you who are here in person are invited to turn to the information cards in the back of the seat in front of you, which has a web address and QR code for giving online. And if you would like to give this morning via check or cash, there will be ushers at the end of the service with baskets that will collect that offering. Thank you so much for your generosity, which sustains the ministry of this church and our partners in the larger community. We make space each week for the concerns of our community life. As a reminder, you can leave prayer requests for our lay ministers to hold in the boxes in either gallery of our sanctuary, or email them to prayer@firstunitarianportland.org. If you have an intention that you would like named here, please send that to parishconcerns@firstunitarianportland.org. We have no individual concerns to share this morning, but we hold in love and care all those joys and sorrows which remain unspoken in the heart that are with us all today. Will you pray with me now? Spirit of life, God, who we know as love, please be with us this morning. Please be with us as we face all that this season brings us. When the warm, sunny days bring us new energy and zest, may we rejoice in them. When we get to linger in long, precious days with our beloveds, may they know how grateful we are. When changed or canceled plans disappoint us, may patience and acceptance be our guides. When life goes on being hard, when the grief doesn't let up just because it's summer, may we lean into the sources of comfort that we know. When the news of the world washes over us like a tidal wave, may we remember the small yet important work that is ours to do, and to do it. Spirit of life, we are carrying so many things right now. Please help us to ask for help, to share the loads of our neighbors. May we all move humbly and face with love all that each new day brings us. Amen, and blessed be. Let us now be together for a time of silence. Please remain seated as we sing together our hymn, From the Crush of Wealth and Power. Our reading this morning is an excerpt from Everybody Has a Heartache, a Blues by Joy Harjo. In the United Terminal in Chicago at 5 on a Friday afternoon, the sky is breaking with rain and wind, and all the flights are delayed forever. We will never get where we are going, and there's no way back to where we've been. The sun and the moon have disappeared to an island far from anywhere. Everybody has a heartache. The man with his head bobbing to music no one can hear has that satisfied feel, a full belly of a sweet, and a wife who sings heartache to sleep. In his luggage that will be lost and never found is a musty dream of flying solo to Africa, with a stop on the return to let go of the stories too difficult to carry home. He will take off his shoes to walk in a warm, tropical sea. He'll sing to the ancestors. Everybody has a heartache. This man speaks to no one, but his body does. Half his liver is swollen with anger. The other half is trying to apologize. What a mess I've made of history, he thinks without thinking. Everybody has a heartache. In the terminal of stopped time, I went unsteady to the beat, driven by a hungry spirit who is drunk with words and songs. What can I do? I have to take care of it. The famished spirit eats fire, poetry, and rain. It only wants love.
thank you for having me among you today in this, the church of my childhood. I know I said this earlier, but it's beautiful to be back with you all. When I was about 8 years old, my parents bought me an unfinished desk, creamy-hued and fresh-smelling. And together we finished it, sanding it smooth and then carefully coating it with a pungent varnish that darkened it to a deep, rich brown. That desk is still in that room where my own kids sometimes spend the night, and it's still smooth. It took a lot of sandpaper to get it that way. Sandpaper is a useful tool because it is abrasive. That's its job, to be rubbed against something until that something is transformed. Similarly, a sandpaper person is the individual we can't avoid, a relative, coworker, member of our friendship circle, maybe a neighbor, whose presence annoys us, rubs us raw. I suspect each of us could name at least one person who, for whatever or no reason, bothers us. Don't do it, just think about it. Before ministry was on my horizon, I was a medical assistant at a nonprofit feminist family planning clinic, where it was an honor to help people access abortions and other kinds of basic health care available in decent societies. One coworker had very low boundaries. She was always sticking her nose into other people's business, inciting the kind of gossip that spirals into drama. Once, and this is while she was on the clock, mind you, she used a clinic phone line to call the number on her hair dye box and ask whoever was unfortunate enough to answer the phone whether the color she had selected would help her get a man. I hope we can all agree that that's annoying. On the other hand, when our schedule would get backed up and I had to leave for a college class and other coworkers had daycare pickup looming, this annoying coworker always stayed late, and she did it cheerfully. She wasn't bad. She just rubbed me the wrong way, like sandpaper. There is a difference between sandpaper people and those who are downright toxic. It's an important distinction. Toxic people are dangerous psychically and sometimes physically. They must be avoided even at high cost. Abrasive behavior should never cover or conceal abuse in any form. But what about the people who are simply irritating? No more, no less. After all, none of us are perfect. As I say in turn to my kids when they have inevitable sibling spats, you too are sometimes annoying, my dear. And I always readily admit that this applies to me, too. Sandpaper people are part of life, after all, and so what to do when we encounter one? It's tempting to write them off as a mysterious, cosmic punishment that must be endured. After all, we can't very well run screaming every time a particular coworker pulls into the parking lot, or that certain relative messages about the party. One way we can learn to live with them is by identifying them as opportunities for spiritual growth. Maybe even a chance to dust off the enemy pie recipe. As much as these people rile and rough us up, maybe they can smooth us out as well. My sandpaper coworker gifted me a teaching. She cornered me one day in my awkward block of counter space and showed me that wrapping and arranging medical instruments in a particular way meant that I could fit more in the autoclave. Sterilizing more equipment at once meant running the machine less often. thus saving environmental resources and a chunk of time over and over throughout the day. Is a practical tip a spiritual lesson? I would argue yes. Yet, the undoubtedly spiritual lesson I got from her is simply that I can learn from people I don't like. The journey from irritation to insight is one of the specialties of US-born Buddhist teacher Pema Chodron. She describes the Tibetan concept of Shenpa as the hook that triggers our habitual tendency to close down and feel spiteful or annoyed. She says that getting unhooked begins by recognizing that moment of unease so we can learn to relax in that moment. Shenpa is usually involuntary, she says, and it gets right to the root of why we suffer. Someone looks at us a certain way, or we hear a certain song, we smell a certain smell, we walk into a certain room, and boom, we're hooked. We're crawling out of our skin with disgust, or irritation, or that feeling of superiority. This is what was happening with my former coworker. Chodron has also experienced what happens when people practice recognizing Shenpa. This is a formal exercise at Gampo Abbey, her Buddhist monastery in Nova Scotia. She reports, "We discovered that some of us could feel Shenpa, even when a particular person simply sat down next to us at the dining table." Her take on what's happening. Shenpa thrives on the underlying insecurity of living in a world that is always changing. We could also call Shenpa the urge to smoke that cigarette, to have another drink, to indulge our addiction, whatever it is. Those with strong addictions know that working with habitual patterns begins with the willingness to fully acknowledge our urge, and then the willingness not to act on it. She writes, "If we can see Shenpa just as we're starting to close down, when we feel the tightening, there's the possibility of catching the urge to do the habitual thing and not doing it." To support this process, Chodron strongly recommends a meditation practice. There are other steps she suggests. Does someone bother you? Stay with the unease, the tightening, the itch of Shenpa. Train in sitting still with that desire to scratch. This is how we learn, she says, to stop the chain reaction of habitual patterns that otherwise rule our lives. If we're willing to practice this over time, prajna begins to kick in. Prajna means clear seeing. That's our innate intelligence, our wisdom. By focusing on prajna, we begin to develop a big picture perspective. We get in the balcony and see the whole chain reaction clearly. As we practice, this wisdom can become a stronger force than Shenpa. That, in and of itself, has the power to stop the chain reaction of being driven to distraction by our sandpaper people. We might not like them. That isn't even the point. But they will no longer provoke in us such vehemence. The earlier we catch it, teaches Chodron, the easier Shenpa is to work with. But even catching it when we're already all worked up is good. Sometimes we have to go through the whole cycle, even though we see what we're doing. The urge is so strong, the hook so sharp, the habitual pattern so sticky, that there are times when we can't do anything about it. But there is still always something we can do after the fact, she reassures us. We can rerun the story. Maybe we start with remembering the all worked up feeling. Get in touch with that. We look clearly at the Shenpa in retrospect. This is very helpful. It's also helpful, she says, to see Shenpa arising in little ways where the hook is not so sharp. If I could turn back the years and re-encounter my sandpaper coworker with the knowledge and spiritual practice that I've tried to cultivate, maybe my thoughts toward her would be gentler and I could have helped make a calmer workplace for us all. At the very least, I would have been more grounded and less snippy, which would have felt good to me. Maybe the person who hooks you is a close relative, and it's an old, deep, powerful cycle. That's a lot to tackle. A realistic goal could be to simply notice when you realize in retrospect that you got stuck in that loop. Developing prajna, that's clear seeing, might prepare you to one day reflect that the reason your neighbor annoys you could be their resemblance in habit or characteristic to the relative with whom you struggle. Well, that's interesting. Start there. What else could you learn? Build up to tackling the really ingrained relationships. The simple act of noticing thoughts can be tremendously liberating when someone is getting on my last nerve. Staying present with hard feelings is difficult. I didn't grow up knowing how to do this. In this culture, most of us don't. It's like finishing a desk. It's a skill to be cultivated, to learn. But if you can get the hang of it, it can be magic. It can keep you from suddenly realizing you're seething with irritation, abandoned with the worst version of yourself, unsure how you got there or how to get back on track. Stabilizing means turning toward our sandpaper people with curiosity. Doesn't have to be affection, but such a posture of openness can reveal that after all, everybody has a heartache. An important reminder from our reading by Joe Harjo, the renowned Muskogee or Creek Nation poet. My friend Cassie gave me permission to share her powerful experience of realizing that everybody has a heartache. Growing up, her family befriended a difficult woman who was hard to be around. At holidays, it seemed like she would come just to criticize and suck the energy out of the room. Years passed, and Cassie settled states away. When Cassie was 7.5 months pregnant, this family friend announced her intention to visit. It wasn't exactly welcome news, but Cassie felt she couldn't refuse, and so 5 days after giving birth, this friend arrived. When the friend didn't get what she wanted, she got mad. Cassie described her mood as a stinky mist that would drift everywhere. She expected a lot of one-on-one attention and was affronted that Cassie was preoccupied with nursing and sleeping and the pretty big transition of having a human come out of her body and into her life. Yet, as the days of the visit wore by, Cassie saw that this person was suffering spiritually. She was isolated. Life had not gone as she desired. She didn't have healthy ways to fix her loneliness. All her stories betrayed that manipulation was her only mode of being in relationship with those from whom she desperately sought affection. Cassie began to see that everybody has a heartache. Cassie even ended up being grateful that she had more than a single holiday meal mediated by others to spend with this family friend. It forced Cassie to be more present with the discomfort of this person's company. And that ultimately proved the key to her noticing what was happening on a deeper level. She started seeing the complexity of this person in all her shortcomings, yes. Yet she also glimpsed the tremendous disappointments that life had contained for this person. Cassie uncovered in herself a well of patience for her friend and humility, even awe that her own life was not marked by similar suffering. Cassie isn't Buddhist, but her story is about working with Shenpa to reach prajna on an interpersonal level. These same concepts are available as we contend not just with personal relationships, but with social structures as well. Many of the systems that govern our lives aren't just irritating, they're downright toxic and abusive. Just staying open and curious about our hooks or triggers, that's not going to address the precipitous climb of grocery store prices and corporate owner profits. By a conservative calculation, 25% of Oregonians are food insecure, and that disproportionately impacts children. That is immoral. A meditation practice alone won't solve it. Yet, children's teachings offer two useful gifts, resources, as we respond to systemic injustice. The first is relationality. Cultivating a Shenpa practice promotes relationship, and solid relational networks are arguably one of the most practically important assets we have in a broken world marked by random and systemically caused suffering. We need our people. Can't put it more simply than that. 2, the second resource is analysis. The calm wisdom of prajna means being grounded enough to experience interpersonal dynamics and understand what might be happening at the core. It takes skill to grok a smaller system between people. Like, it took me a while to figure out that my coworkers' attention-seeking chaos rattled me because I was really nervous about my first full-time professional job, and I didn't want anything to interfere with me doing it and doing it well. That kind of insight can scale up. Take an example from recent headlines, like abortion. We hear a lot of interesting case studies about whether someone's personal circumstances reasonably warrant terminating a pregnancy. And sure, these stories are important. We need to keep telling them and listening to them. Yet, when we're scrolling through our social media feed and reading all the memes about this, if we can apply our practices of calm, clarity, and curiosity, a bigger picture emerges. Under the individual narratives is the core reality, structural reality, that some bodies, especially bodies that aren't considered male or white or able-bodied or cis or wealthy enough, it's a long list. Some bodies are being denied care and autonomy. This wider perspective, then, might crystallize and motivate us towards collective strategy and action, because we can get in the balcony and see what's happening. And we can even craft bigger goals, like bodily freedom for all. Never doubt that spiritual grounding is a politically liberatory act, even and probably especially when there's friction. Sandpaper's abrasive quality is designed to generate friction. Locating that point, finding the emotional resistance, is important because that abrasive rub is where the learning can happen. It's where we encounter Shenpa, our hooks, and also, hopefully, eventually, the clear sight of prajna. The friction is how my desk got sanded all those years ago across town. It's where I learned from a difficult coworker, and where Cassie discovered that everybody has a heartache. The sandpaper people in our lives may rub us raw, but if we can greet the resistance as a teacher, then we can hope to be rubbed smooth. Will you pray with me, however it is that you might be with prayer? Spirit of life, you who evolves with us in name and experience, dear God, help us embrace the lessons life delivers, even and maybe especially when our teacher guides provoke as well as educate. It will always be our human task to discern and respond as we grow, to refuse harm and cherish flourishing. Let us know ourselves as vessels of infinite possibility, holders of each other's heartaches and tales of joy alike, weavers of one story in which we each have our part. Amen. And together once more, let us sing, "If Every Woman in the World." Joe Harjo sends us forth. And whom do I call my enemy? An enemy must be worthy of engagement. I turn in the direction of the sun and keep walking. It's the heart that asks the question, not my furious mind. The heart is the smaller cousin of the sun. It sees and knows everything. It hears the gnashing, even as it hears the blessing. The door to the mind should only open from the heart. An enemy who gets in risks the danger of becoming a friend. Go in peace.